16-year-old Jake had finally convinced his parents he was responsible enough to stay home alone while they celebrated New Year's Eve at a friend's house in the next town over. It felt like freedom, no early curfews, no endless questions about his plans, just a quiet night with pizza, movies, and gaming. The evening started as he imagined. Snow fell lightly outside, and fireworks popped in the distance. Jake lounged on the couch, scrolling his phone, occasionally glancing at the movie playing in the background. Around 10:30 p.m., the house began to feel unusually quiet. The festive noises from outside had died down, and the hum of the heater seemed louder than usual. Jake brushed it off, figuring the neighbors had gone inside to prepare for the midnight celebrations. Then came the sound, a light thud from upstairs. Jake frowned. It could be the old pipes or the wind against the windows. This wasn't the first time he'd heard strange noises in the house. But the second thud, heavier and more deliberate, sent a shiver down his spine. Grabbing his phone, Jake stood and crept to the bottom of the staircase. "Hello?" he called, his voice breaking slightly. No answer. He hesitated. Maybe something fell over. But nothing upstairs should have been able to make that kind of noise. Swallowing his fear, he climbed the stairs cautiously, each step creaking beneath his weight. At the top of the stairs, he paused. The hallway was dark, except for the faint glow from his bedroom at the end of the hall. The noise had come from the guest room, though. He reached for the light switch on the wall and flipped it on. Nothing looked out of place. The doors to all the rooms were closed, and the air was still. Jake moved toward the guest room door, his hand shaking as he turned the knob. Inside, everything was as it should be until he noticed the window. It was slightly open. Jake's stomach sank. He was sure he'd locked it earlier. He stepped closer and saw faint traces of melted snow on the windowsill. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make his pulse race. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the kitchen downstairs. Jake's heart leapt into his throat. He spun around and bolted back down the stairs, nearly tripping on the last step. The kitchen light was on now. He knew he'd turned it off earlier. On the counter, one of the knives from the wooden block was missing. His first thought was to call his parents, but he didn't want to sound paranoid. Instead, he dialed 911 and whispered into the phone, explaining the situation. The operator stayed on the line and told him to find a safe place to hide until the police arrived. Jake locked himself in the pantry, clutching his phone tightly. He could hear faint creaks on the floorboards outside, as if someone was moving through the house. His breathing was shallow, his mind racing with possibilities. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway brought a flood of relief. Red and blue lights flashed through the frosted window. The footsteps stopped, and Jake heard the front door creak open. The police searched the house but found no one. The back door was unlocked, and footprints in the snow led away from the house, disappearing into the woods behind the yard. The officer assured Jake he'd done the right thing by calling and offered to stay until his parents returned. As they left, Jake caught sight of something on the kitchen counter: his missing knife, clean and neatly placed back in the block. When Jake pointed it out, the officer frowned but said nothing. They left the light on in the kitchen as they locked up the house. Jake never stayed home alone again. After the police left, Jake sat in the kitchen for a long time, reflecting on what had just happened. The sense of safety didn't return, even after all the doors were checked and locked. He still felt someone was in the house, even though physically they had left. Every creak of the floorboards, every quiet sound, made him jump. He decided to call his parents. Their trip was almost over, and he hoped that hearing their voices would help calm him down. But when his mother picked up the phone, her voice sounded strained, disoriented. "Jake, the police just called us," she said. "You're not with us? Are you okay? They told us someone tried to scare you. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Mom," Jake replied, trying to sound calm, though his voice was shaky. The police came, checked the house, but no one explained what happened. "I don't know what to think." There was silence on the other end for a moment, then his mother spoke again, her voice now more anxious. "Do you remember Mrs. Price, the old neighbor who lives next door?" she asked. "I called her after I found out you were alone. She said she saw something strange by our house. She's sure it wasn't just someone passing by." Jake clenched his phone tighter. "What exactly did she see?" "She said she saw someone standing by your window around the time you heard those noises. She thought it was just someone lost at first, but when she saw his face, she realized it wasn't just any random person." Jake felt his stomach drop. It wasn't just him, any more other people had noticed something off, too. And that made it all feel much more real. But there was something unsettling about the way his mom said it, too. Why would Mrs. Price be so sure about the person's face? Jake looked back toward the kitchen, where his phone was still lying on the counter. And suddenly, something clicked. Why hadn't the police told his parents anything about what they found? If they thought someone had been in the house, why hadn't they informed them? Why did they focus so much on making sure Jake was okay but not address the real issue? "Mom," he said slowly, his voice a bit shaky, "I still feel like someone was in here. I need to check the security cameras." "I know, honey, I know you're scared, but if something happened, we'll deal with it together," his mom said, trying to soothe him. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling. His mind wouldn't rest after he noticed something the police had missed, one small detail. Near the spot where the knife had fallen, there were other marks on the kitchen rug. They were almost imperceptible, as if someone had been in the house before the police had arrived, leaving a faint shadow behind. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The marks on the kitchen rug, the way the police had rushed through the house without fully explaining anything, it all gnawed at him. After his conversation with his mom, he couldn't wait for her to get home. He needed answers, or at least a sense of control over the situation. He grabbed his phone again, went into the living room, and started scrolling through the footage from the security cameras. The house wasn't large, and the cameras covered all the main areas: living room, kitchen, hallway, and the front porch. The first few minutes of footage were just as he expected, calm, uneventful. He watched himself pacing around the house earlier in the night, just as he'd remembered. Then, about an hour after he'd heard the first noise upstairs, the footage from the front porch camera caught something that made Jake's blood run cold. A figure. Not clearly visible at first, but standing just off to the side of the porch. The shadow moved slowly, lingering near the door. Jake froze. The person wasn't standing in a normal posture, but more like they were trying to stay hidden, their movements deliberate and careful. Jake rewound the footage and played it again. He zoomed in as best as he could on the figure's face when they turned briefly toward the porch light. It wasn't a stranger. It was someone he knew. His heart skipped a beat. It was Ben, his older cousin, someone who had always made him uneasy with his unpredictable behavior. But why was he here? Jake's hands trembled as he paused the video. He'd barely spoken to Ben in months, after a falling out over something stupid at a family gathering. But he hadn't expected this. His cousin hadn't even called to wish him a happy new year, so why would he sneak around his house at this hour? Suddenly, his phone buzzed in his hand. A message from his mom. "We're on our way home now. Everything okay?" Jake typed back quickly, "I think I know who it was." The next half hour felt like a lifetime. When his parents finally returned, Jake didn't wait for them to settle in. He took them straight to the living room and showed them the footage. His mom was the first to speak, her face a mix of disbelief and concern. "Ben, what was he doing out there?" "I don't know," Jake replied, shaking his head. "But I think he came inside. I saw the marks on the rug. It looks like he went through the kitchen, probably after the door was left unlocked." His father was quiet for a moment, processing what he was hearing. "You need to talk to him," he said finally. "But maybe not right now. Let's make sure everything's safe first." They all walked around the house together, double-checking every door and window. Jake's parents weren't angry, just concerned. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Ben had been testing something. Was he trying to scare him? Or was it something more? The next day, his mom reached out to Ben, but when they called him, he didn't answer. His phone went straight to voicemail. For a week, they didn't hear from him. It wasn't until the following weekend when Ben finally showed up, unannounced, at the front door. His parents let him in, but Jake kept his distance. Ben didn't seem like the same person. He was distant, avoiding eye contact, as if pretending nothing had happened. Jake didn't confront him immediately. Instead, he kept his suspicions to himself, waiting for Ben to either explain himself or slip up. But he never did. The whole situation faded into a strange, uncomfortable memory. Ben never acknowledged the incident, and life went on. Jake never felt fully safe in the house again, though. There was always a part of him that felt like someone, maybe even Ben, was still watching. And sometimes, in the quiet moments of the night, Jake would hear a sound from upstairs. A creak in the floorboards. A door slightly ajar. But he never investigated again. Not fully. It was just too unsettling. As the months went by, the feeling slowly dulled, but the memory of that New Year's Eve stayed with him. Jake learned to trust his instincts, even if he never fully understood what had happened that night. But deep down, he knew one thing for sure. Sometimes, the people you think you know can be far more unpredictable than you ever imagined. Ethan was looking forward to having the house to himself. His parents had gone away for a few days to visit relatives, and although he had never been fully alone for this long, he felt confident that he'd enjoy the solitude. At 17, he was used to being independent, and his plan was simple: stay up late, play video games, eat junk food, and enjoy the peacefulness of an empty house. No one to tell him what to do, no interruptions. Just him, his Xbox, and a few movies. His parents had left in the afternoon, and by the time evening rolled around, he was settling into the couch with a bag of chips, controller in hand. The house felt empty, almost unnervingly so. The silence was different from the usual background noise of family life, and Ethan found himself missing the familiar hum of his parents going about their business. By 9:30 p.m., he felt a strange unease. It wasn't anything specific, just an odd sense of stillness, like the house was holding its breath. He brushed it off and went back to his game. But then, a sound cut through the quiet, a faint tapping. It was coming from the back door. Ethan froze, his thumb hovering over the controller. The sound was soft, like a knock or a tap on the window. His first thought was that it was the wind or maybe an animal outside, but the noise was persistent. Top, top, tap. He stood up slowly, trying to stay calm. He knew the back door was locked. He had made sure of that when his parents left. Still, the tapping continued, and he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He hesitated, trying to decide whether to check or ignore it. Curiosity won out. He grabbed his phone and checked the time, 10:15 p.m. It was too late for anyone to be dropping by, especially uninvited. He approached the back door cautiously, glancing out the window through the curtains. There was no one there, just the empty, dark backyard. The tapping stopped as soon as he checked. Ethan's heart was still pounding, but he figured it was just his imagination. He locked the door again, double-checked all the windows, and returned to his game. Maybe it had just been a branch or something. But then it happened again. This time, the tapping was louder, more insistent, and it came from the front door. Ethan's stomach churned. He hadn't heard anyone pull into the driveway, and he was certain no one was supposed to come by. He stood in the living room, staring at the front door, his mind racing. He grabbed his phone, ready to call his parents or the police, but paused. What would he even say? That someone was knocking on his door at 10:30 p.m. for no reason? He didn't want to seem paranoid. The tapping grew louder, now accompanied by a soft scraping sound like someone running their fingers along the wood of the door. Ethan didn't think. He quickly grabbed a flashlight, turned off all the lights in the house, and quietly crept toward the door. His breath was shallow, his hands clammy as he peered through the peephole. Nothing. Just the empty porch. But then he noticed something else. The doormat was slightly askew, as if it had been moved. His stomach dropped. Ethan slowly opened the door just a crack, enough to peer outside without fully revealing himself. The porch was empty, but the doormat had definitely been disturbed. His pulse quickened as he stepped back inside, his mind racing with possibilities. Was someone trying to get in? Why was the mat moved? He bolted the door and turned all the lights on, sitting in the living room with his phone in hand. His hands trembled as he texted his mom, asking if they were planning to come back early. Her reply came a few minutes later. No, we're staying over another night. Why? Is everything okay? Ethan quickly typed, I keep hearing noises. Tapping on the doors. I don't know if I'm just freaking out, but I don't feel safe here right now. His mom replied almost instantly, It's probably nothing, just the wind. Try to relax. We'll be home tomorrow. He didn't feel relaxed. In fact, his fear was growing. As the clock ticked on, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that someone was near. That feeling of being watched crept over him again, and every small sound made him jump. At midnight, Ethan received a text from an unknown number. It was a simple message: "I know you're alone." His blood ran cold. Who was this? How did they know? He texted back, "Who is this?" No reply came. His hands shook as he debated whether to call the police, but then another text came through: "Don't worry, I'm just watching. I won't hurt you." Ethan's heart raced as he backed into the corner of the room, staring at his phone. He was alone, with no one nearby to help. Every little sound, the wind, the creaking of the floorboards, sent him into a panic. He quickly locked all the doors again, checked the windows, and huddled in the living room, keeping an eye on the front door and the back. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and silence. No more knocks, no more texts. His parents didn't come home until the next afternoon, and when they did, Ethan explained what had happened. They seemed concerned, but chalked it up to his imagination, especially given that nothing had happened after the texts stopped. Despite their reassurances, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching him that night. The odd noises, the disturbed mat, and the chilling texts. He couldn't let go of the thought that whoever had been there might still be close. It wasn't until a few days later that Ethan saw something he wished he hadn't. As he was leaving for school, he noticed something in the yard: footprints in the freshly fallen snow. They were clear, and they led right up to his back door. Ethan wasn't sure if it was just his mind playing tricks, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that the night he spent alone had been more than just a series of strange noises. He had been watched, and the person who did it was still out there. Ethan stood frozen in his driveway, staring at the footprints in the snow. They were too fresh to have been left overnight, especially considering the heavy snowfall that had happened just a few hours ago. He hadn't heard anyone come near the house that morning, but there they were, footprints leading right up to the back door. His heart started pounding again. The last few nights had been unsettling, but now it felt real. Whoever had been knocking on his doors and sending him those strange texts had been physically near the house. Ethan quickly stepped back inside, locking the door behind him. His breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to process what was happening. Was someone still watching him? Was it someone who lived nearby, or worse, someone he didn't know at all? He couldn't ignore the feeling in his gut that something wasn't right. Taking out his phone, Ethan sent another text to his parents, who still hadn't returned. "Mom, there are footprints outside the back door. They lead right up to it. I don't know what's going on, but I'm really freaked out right now." A few minutes later, his mom replied, "Are you sure? Maybe it's just the wind or an animal. Try to calm down. We're on our way back. Just hang tight until we get there." Ethan wasn't convinced. He knew the footprints weren't made by an animal, they were too deliberate, too human. He grabbed his phone and, for the first time, considered calling the police. But what could he say? He had no idea who was doing this or why. All he had were a few texts, some strange knocks, and the unsettling feeling that someone had been watching him. He decided to go outside again, carefully checking the footprints from his window first to make sure no one was there. The coast seemed clear. The tracks were still visible, leading toward the back door, and then disappearing into the yard beyond. Ethan debated for a moment, then grabbed his flashlight and opened the door just a crack. Nothing. The backyard was empty, eerily quiet. but the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. He felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up as he stepped outside. Scanning the dark yard, the snow was undisturbed in most places. But the footprints leading up to the door told a different story. Ethan quickly retreated back inside and locked the door behind him again. He felt paranoid now, constantly glancing over his shoulder, his heart racing with every creak and groan of the old house. Then, his phone buzzed again. It was a new message from the unknown number. "You're not alone, Ethan. I'm just a few steps away." Panic hit him like a wave. Who was this? How could they know his name? How could they know where he was? His hands trembled as he typed back, "What do you want?" The response came almost immediately, "Nothing. Just wanted to see how long it would take you to realize I'm watching. You'll never know when I'm close." Ethan couldn't stay in the house anymore. He felt trapped, vulnerable, and unsafe. His mind raced as he considered his options. Should he call the police? Should he wait for his parents to return? Could he risk staying there another night? His phone buzzed again, and he quickly checked it, half expecting another chilling message. But this time, it wasn't a text, it was a notification from the security system app he had on his phone. The cameras on his property had detected motion. Ethan opened the app and scanned the footage from the backyard cameras. His hands shook as he watched the playback, heart racing as he saw movement near the back door. There, in the dark, was a figure, someone wearing a hooded jacket, walking calmly across the yard. The figure didn't seem to notice the cameras, and they didn't approach the house directly. Instead, they walked along the fence line, disappearing into the shadows. Ethan's breath hitched in his chest. Who was that? Why were they out there? The figure had to be the person who had been knocking on the door and sending the messages. This wasn't just a prank. Someone had been outside, watching him, and now they were getting closer. Without thinking, Ethan grabbed his phone, quickly dialed 911, and explained everything about the strange knocking, the texts, the footprints, and the person he saw on the security footage. The dispatcher reassured him that help was on the way, but Ethan felt no comfort. The idea of waiting in that house with no one around made him feel completely exposed. He locked all the doors again and pulled the blinds shut, hiding any sign of movement from the windows. Every few seconds, he checked the security app, watching the camera footage anxiously, praying that he wouldn't see that figure again. The police arrived about 20 minutes later, just as Ethan was starting to feel the overwhelming weight of fear closing in around him. They checked the perimeter of the house, interviewed him briefly, and looked over the security footage. One of the officers noted the tracks outside and said they would check the area for any signs of the person who had been lurking nearby. Despite their reassurances, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been outside was still out there just waiting. The officers took a report, told him to stay inside and lock the doors, and assured him that they would be patrolling the area for the next few hours. By the time his parents returned the following morning, everything had returned to normal on the surface. The police had found no sign of the intruder, and Ethan's parents, while concerned, seemed to believe that it had all been a misunderstanding. Maybe it was a neighbor playing a prank, they said. But Ethan knew the truth. He knew someone had been watching him. The terror he felt that night wouldn't fade easily. And even though life eventually returned to normal, a part of him would always feel the eyes of that unknown figure on him, just waiting for the next moment to strike. The police left the house late that night, promising to follow up if they found anything else. Ethan was left with his thoughts, the empty house, and the uneasy feeling that lingered in the corners of his mind. His parents returned the next morning, and while they were relieved to see him safe, they were skeptical of the events he'd described. His mom brushed it off as just a prank, something harmless, while his dad chalked it up to paranoia. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened. The texts, the footprints, the figure he saw on the security footage, it all felt too real. Still, the days passed, and the house became quieter, as though the tension had never existed. The footage from the cameras was reviewed once more by the police, but they had no answers. The figure in the footage was too blurry to make out, and the snow had covered any further footprints, leaving no trace. No one had been caught, and nothing else seemed out of the ordinary in the neighborhood. Ethan went back to his normal routine, but he was never the same. He kept checking the locks on the doors and windows more than usual, and the security cameras were constantly running. Every car that passed the house, every shadow in the yard, made him tense. But life slowly returned to normal, and eventually, the memory of that night faded into the background. A few months later, Ethan moved on, though with a lingering sense of caution. He'd learned to live with the discomfort of not knowing who had been watching him that New Year's Eve. The strange figure, the eerie messages, and the feeling of being unsafe remained a part of him, even if the events themselves seemed to fade with time. The fear never entirely left, but Ethan managed to push it aside. He told himself it was just a random series of events, maybe a prank, maybe someone who had just been passing through. But in the quiet moments, when he was alone again, the unease crept back in just enough to remind him that sometimes, the scariest things aren't always explained. The figure in the yard never returned, but Ethan kept checking the cameras, always watching. Always wondering if that night had been the beginning of something far worse than he'd ever been prepared for. David had been looking forward to spending the new year alone. His parents had gone on a short trip to visit family, and he had the house all to himself. At 16, it felt like the perfect opportunity to relax, binge-watch some movies, and enjoy the peace and quiet without the usual family chaos. He'd planned to keep his phone charged and text his parents now and then, but they'd both assured him that everything was fine, and there was no reason to worry. Still, as midnight approached, the house felt strangely quiet. It wasn't that David was scared, he was used to being home alone, but something about the emptiness in the air unsettled him. Around 11:30 p.m., he heard the first noise. A faint knock, or maybe a tap, came from the back door. David froze, unsure if he'd imagined it. He was a little on edge now, but convinced it was just a random sound, maybe a branch brushing against the window. He checked the back door to make sure it was locked. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, so he went back to the couch, picking up his phone to check social media. The knocking came again, this time a little louder. His heart raced. He wasn't expecting anyone, and no one had texted him to say they'd be dropping by. It could be a neighbor, he thought, maybe someone needed help with something. But as he approached the back door, a sinking feeling took over him. There was no one outside when he looked through the peephole. He stood there for a moment, hesitating. Maybe it was just kids messing around, or maybe it was a neighbor who'd knocked and walked off. His thoughts raced. The night felt like it was closing in on him. He locked the door again and stepped back toward the living room, telling himself to relax. But then, just as he settled back down, he heard the sound again. This time, it wasn't from the back door but from upstairs, his bedroom, to be specific. David's stomach churned. He hadn't heard anything like this before. It wasn't the usual creaking of the house settling. It was a deliberate sound, a faint scraping, followed by a soft shuffle. Panic gripped him. No one else was supposed to be here, and the idea that someone was in the house was too much to ignore. He stood frozen for a moment, trying to decide what to do. His mind raced. Should he call the police? His parents? But what would he even say? I heard a noise. He didn't want to overreact, but at the same time, everything in him screamed to act. David grabbed his phone and texted his mom quickly. Just heard something upstairs. Should I call the police? His mom's response was quick. Are you sure? Maybe it's just the house settling. He texted back, I don't think so. David stood in the hallway, unsure whether to go upstairs and investigate or wait for his parents to call back. The house felt eerily still now, and the soft shuffling noise had stopped. He decided to check the stairs, moving slowly so as not to alert whoever or whatever was upstairs. As he reached the top of the stairs, his phone buzzed again. His mom had replied, We're on our way home. Stay in the kitchen and lock the door behind you. Just then, David heard a faint creak from behind him. He spun around, but no one was there. Panic hit him. His heart raced as he slowly turned back to the stairs, feeling trapped. It wasn't until a minute later that David heard the sound again. Only this time, it wasn't from upstairs. It was from inside the kitchen. David immediately texted his mom again. Mom, there's definitely someone here. I think they're in the kitchen. He didn't wait for a response this time. He grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer and crept toward the door, his breath shallow and rapid. When he slowly peeked inside the kitchen, he was met with nothing but the empty, dimly lit room. Everything seemed fine except the window. It was slightly cracked open. He didn't remember opening it, and the thought of someone sneaking in that way terrified him. He immediately locked the kitchen window and checked all the other doors and windows again. But the feeling of being watched lingered in the pit of his stomach. David went back to the living room, trying to calm himself down, telling himself that it could have been a squirrel or some other animal messing around in the walls, but deep down, he knew better. He couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on him, and every little noise made him jump. The minutes dragged on as he sat, tense, waiting for his parents to come home. Finally, around 1:30 a.m., he got another text from his mom. We're just pulling into the driveway now. Everything okay? David texted back. Yeah, but can you check the kitchen window? I think someone was here. When his parents arrived, they immediately checked the house, starting with the back door and kitchen. His mom nodded at him as she closed the window. It was probably just a draft, she said softly. The house has a way of making noises. But David wasn't convinced. Something about that night still felt wrong. And when he looked back at the door to his room, he swore he saw something. A shadow, moving ever so slightly near the corner. The next morning, David's mom told him they'd called the police just to be safe. A few officers came by to check, but there were no signs of forced entry or anything unusual. But David knew what he felt, and deep down, he couldn't shake the idea that someone had been there, someone who hadn't been supposed to be. He never figured out exactly what had happened that night. His parents, reassuring him that it was just a mistake or a misunderstanding, tried to put his mind at ease. But David knew better. The fear, the unsettling noises, the feeling of being watched, it was something that stayed with him long after New Year's had passed. And every time the house creaked or a door latched on its own, David would glance toward the stairs, half expecting someone to be there, watching him. Days passed, and the unease still lingered in David's mind. Though his parents reassured him that everything was fine and that he had probably just been imagining things, there was a part of him that couldn't forget the feeling of someone being in the house that night. It wasn't just the sounds, it was the way the atmosphere had felt, as if something wasn't quite right. David tried to go about his routine, but he found himself constantly checking over his shoulder, especially when he was alone in the house. The feeling of being watched never fully went away. Every small creak, every gust of wind against the windows, made him jump. Then, 2 weeks after the incident, David was going through his daily routine. His parents had left to do some grocery shopping, and he was home alone again. The house felt quieter than usual, as if the silence was thicker this time. He had just finished eating when he heard a faint scratching sound from the back door. David froze, heart pounding in his chest. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. It wasn't the wind this time. He could hear it distinctly, like something was scraping against the door. He stood up, slowly, and tiptoed to the kitchen, trying to ignore the feeling of dread rising in his chest. His phone was on the counter, and his instinct was to grab it, to call his parents or the police, but for some reason, he couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he quietly crept toward the back door and peeked through the window. There was nothing. The door was still locked, and there was no sign of anyone standing outside. It was just the same old backyard, dark and quiet. But David couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. He carefully checked the door, confirming that it was locked, and then double-checked all the other windows and doors in the house. But this time, there was no sense of relief. He felt that same heavy weight in the air, like someone was watching him from somewhere, waiting for him to let his guard down. The thought of Ben crossed his mind again, the strange presence he'd felt that night, the shadow he thought he'd seen near the door. But Ben had disappeared from his life after that incident. David hadn't heard from him since. The tension in the house made it hard for him to focus on anything, so he decided to leave for a walk, just to get some fresh air and clear his head. He texted his parents to let them know he was stepping out. As he walked around the neighborhood, he tried to shake the feeling that something was following him, that eyes were on him from every shadowed corner. The streets were quiet, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath his boots. When he turned a corner near his house, he saw a familiar face walking toward him. It was Mrs. Grant, an elderly neighbor who lived a few houses down. "Hey, David," she called out, waving. "Everything okay at home?" David hesitated, unsure how to respond. "Yeah, everything's fine," he said, forcing a smile. "Just, a little bored." Mrs. Grant nodded knowingly. "You've been looking a bit on edge lately. You're sure everything's all right in that house of yours? It's a big place, and I've noticed some odd things happening lately. Small noises, mostly at night. David felt his heart race. Like what kind of noises? He asked, trying to sound casual. Hard to say. A door creaking. A window rattling. Sometimes, it feels like someone's walking through the halls, but there's no one there. You've had anything like that happen recently? David's breath caught in his throat. She had noticed it too. No, he replied quickly, trying to keep his voice steady. I mean, maybe, just. The house is old. It makes noises sometimes. Mrs. Grant didn't seem convinced. Well, if you ever need someone to check in, you know where to find me. Don't stay in there too long if you're not feeling right. The world's a strange place these days. David nodded, feeling a wave of unease wash over him. He thanked her and quickly walked back to his house, but the knot in his stomach only tightened. Later that evening, when his parents returned, David told them about Mrs. Grant's comments. His dad seemed a little concerned, but his mom shrugged it off. It's just an old house, David. People's imaginations can run wild. You're fine, nothing's wrong. But David wasn't so sure anymore. After that, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, waiting. The strange noises, the shadows at the corner of his vision, it felt too real, too constant. He didn't want to seem paranoid, but the house no longer felt like a place of comfort. It felt like a place with too many secrets, a place where someone was always just out of sight. And even though his parents dismissed his worries, David couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still to come. Each night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he waited for the sound of footsteps. The sound of a door creaking open. The feeling that someone was just outside, watching. And in the back of his mind, he knew one thing for sure, he wasn't imagining it. The next few days dragged on in an unsettling fog. David tried to ignore the nagging feeling, forcing himself to go about his routine, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. The sense that something or someone was always just out of sight weighed heavily on him. Even in the daylight, the house felt oppressive, its walls too quiet, too still. One evening, as he sat at his desk, trying to concentrate on his homework, the noise came again. The faint creak from the back door. It wasn't a gust of wind this time. It was deliberate. He could hear it clearly, as if someone was gently pressing against the door, trying to get inside. His heart skipped a beat, and his first instinct was to grab his phone. But then he stopped. He couldn't keep living in fear. Maybe it was just the house settling, maybe he was being paranoid. He didn't want to seem like he was overreacting, especially after the way his parents had dismissed his concerns. He stood up, walked to the door, and slowly peered through the window. The backyard was dark, empty. No one was there. David exhaled sharply, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. But as he turned to walk back inside, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The back door, which he had double-checked earlier, was slightly ajar. His first thought was that he must have forgotten to lock it, but the possibility of someone breaking in was too real. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He quickly closed the door and locked it again, his hands shaking slightly. He stood there for a moment, trying to calm himself down. But the silence in the house was deafening, and he couldn't shake the feeling of someone being near. Then his phone buzzed. It was a text from his mom. "Hey, just checking in. Everything all right?" David texted back quickly. Yeah, just heard something. I don't know. Maybe it was nothing. His mom's reply was reassuring, but David didn't feel reassured at all. He spent the next few hours in the living room, keeping an eye on the doors and windows, but nothing happened. No more noises. No more odd occurrences. The next morning, David's parents returned. They seemed in a good mood, laughing about their trip, but David couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. He mentioned the door being ajar, but his dad shrugged it off. You probably just forgot to lock it, David. The house is old, things happen. Let's not turn this into a big deal. David wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or frustrated. The logical part of him knew they were probably right, it was just an old house with some quirks. But the part of him that had felt watched, the part of him that had heard the noises, couldn't let it go. Days passed, and slowly, the unease started to fade. The house felt like home again. The noises stopped. The feeling of being watched drifted away. But as time went on, David couldn't shake one final thought. Maybe it wasn't just his imagination. Maybe there had been something or someone there that night. But maybe, just maybe, it was over now. He would never know for sure. But he wasn't about to spend another New Year alone to find out.